those who remain in the new IFB, those who remain associated with Anderson and who refuse to renounce those things, they will continue to put out people in their churches that are good soul winners, and they will also put out child abusers and wife beaters. There's going to be stories over time about abusive husbands, horrible situations of child abuse. I think we'll hear about it from stories from pastors doing it, church members doing it, and every time it's going to get associated with new IFB. And just like cover-ups and sexual abuse is often associated with IFB. You know, I think we're going to see the wife beating and the child beating. We're going to see that associated with the new IFB. It's going to be a common thing that's going to come out, always making the good things the new IFB stands for look bad.
Already pre-tribbers are saying, see, I told you, those guys that don't believe in pre-trib, they think that Jesus is going to beat his bride, just like Anderson beats his bride.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Rediscover People podcast. Today I'm here with two wonderful pastors. The first one is?
Yeah, my name is Matt Furse, pastor, Mountain View Baptist Church, Custer, South Dakota.
Okay, and?
Tommy McMurtry, Liberty Baptist Church in Rock Falls, Illinois.
All right, and we're here today because we're talking a lot about what is going on in the NIFB and Steven Anderson. And my first question is, some of you at one point were drawn into that, right? Drawn into him or the NIFB and the ministry in his early days. And so what was it initially that attracted you to his leadership? And how did it align with your understanding of your biblical teachings at the time?
So for me, I think it was 2012, a young man that I had led to the Lord moved away, but he connected with me and said, "Hey, Pastor, have you ever heard of Sanderson 1611? Well, I didn't know who Sanderson was, but 1611 sounded like probably King James. And he said, check this out. So I watched a couple things, and what was happening right at the time that I was looking at it was after the tribulation was being advertised, his teaching on post-trib versus a pre-trib rapture, and then the advertisement for after the tribulation with Kent Hovind, and narrated by Roland Rasmussen, who I had read his book. And I was like, wow, you know, this is really interesting to me. I was not pre-trib for several years before this. My pastor wasn't. And so I thought, this is going to be awesome. We've got an independent Baptist, King James, soul winning, that's talking about this, and he's got pretty good video. And, of course, I didn't know that was Paul's work, but I thought this is going to be great, you know, and we're really going to be able to help people understand that there's an issue here with pre-trib and the falsehood of it. So that's what sucked me in was the after the tribulation. Now, I didn't agree with everything in the after the tribulation video, but I agreed with the main premise, and I was glad to see it. So that's where I was first introduced and excited. And back then, nobody really knew Steven Anderson hardly, and the crazy weird stuff hadn't come out, and so I thought it was pretty harmless at the time.
Yeah, and yourself?
Yeah, I don't even really remember my first time I noticed Pastor Anderson, because I would see little things here and there, but I think what got my attention originally was after the tribulation. I had been studying end times to teach at our church, and I was struggling making the pre-trib work, and I was having a conversation with my wife about it one day, and she mentioned, I guess she had seen a trailer for After the Tribulation. I don't even know if it had come out yet. And then I saw that, and I had seen some of his stuff, didn't really like him. And so I wasn't that interested. But then later I ended up watching it, and a lot of stuff went over my head because I was still pretty early on in that. I was thinking more mid-trib, and I had a lot of different terminology and stuff. So there were several things I didn't get when I first saw it because he used a different terminology. And I kind of just, because I wasn't a big fan, I didn't really want to be influenced by him. I wanted to just be influenced by the Bible. And so I ended up coming around really more on this issue of Israel before the rapture. I realized I had been wrong about Israel. And I remember I preached my first sermon about Israel shortly before Marching to Zion came out. And then I remember I watched Marching to Zion, and I could not believe how much I agreed with it. And after I saw Marching to Zion, I was like, okay, maybe I need to give this guy a chance. And so then I started listening to more of his stuff. I watched his Revelation series, and then he filled in a lot of blanks for me on stuff I was struggling with when it came to end times and the rapture. And he just kind of slowly grew on me. So it was more of the eschatology than anything else for me.
And to follow up with that, after the tribulation came out, we had already planned a family vacation to see Grand Canyon, and so I thought, hey, that's not far from Phoenix. So on a Wednesday night, we went down there. That's the one and only time I've ever talked to Steven Anderson face to face, and I just said, hey, I really appreciated you guys talking about the tribulation issue and questioning the pre-trib, and I just want to shake your hand and say, you're not the only pastor out there. There's pastors that are out there that have been studying this and looking at this too. We just don't have the video quality that you do. And then I said to him, but I really think if you really want to get this thing going, you got to talk about Israel, and you got to explain who is Israel. And so it was just within months that he called me and said, hey, I want to do a documentary on Israel called Marching to Zion. And he said, we got this one about the King James coming out, but then I want to do that one. Well, of course, I was interested in that. And so I agreed to do that. And I met with Paul out in L.A., and answered questions for the Marching to Zion documentary. But yeah, just like Tommy said, it's the eschatology stuff from a King James perspective, independent Baptist, what we would assume trustworthy, we assume on the same page, and that's what drew me in, and I think Tommy as well.
Yeah, it definitely drew me in as well. I mean, I've been watching Paul's. It's interesting you bring up Paul, because I've been watching Paul's work since he did What in the World Are They Spraying Up There, right? So I watched that. I watched his next one, and then I saw After the Tribulation, and that's what prompted me to start looking at his older videos. Because apparently he was a pioneer on YouTube, so he was doing it long before a lot of people, and it made me, like, now looking in hindsight, looking at the time period that he kind of grew and became bigger, what do you think that was about? It was, because he started off, Obama times, and then he talked about praying Obama would die and that kind of thing, which sparked a lot of controversy, right? But then he just kept rising and rising and rising. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think we're in the age where what you see on the screen is the truth, and people don't read anymore; they just watch stuff, and so it was a great time for that to happen. And then if you are willing to say stuff that other people won't say, and as long as most of it's true or biblical, people will gravitate to that. And then there's something within us as human beings that we imagine the person on the screen is even better than they are, versus the plain, ordinary, boring pastor we have in front of us every week. You know what I mean?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
well, and I think one thing we all have to admit about Pastor Anderson, he is a very intelligent individual, and he's very smart, and he knew how to use the YouTube algorithm. And I think he had kind of like an Alex Jones effect as well too, where Alex Jones, he's very passionate, he's very entertaining, he's very controversial, and he gets your attention. And maybe, he goes a little too far sometime, but it gets your attention. And so Anderson was able to do that. He used that. He used kind of some of the crazy stuff, the saying the really extreme things. He would have those viral moments. And when you're somebody, too, who is post-trib in the IFB world, you're kind of a very lonely person. And so when you see that guy out there getting that message out in a big way like that, you're kind of cheering it on, even if it's like, well, I don't know if I would want to behave that way or act that way, but you're just glad that message is getting out, even if you don't completely approve of how it's being done. And he absolutely did succeed in doing that, and I'm thankful for that. I do think God used that in a positive way.
Yeah, I think a lot of it should be attributed to Paul too. I mean, Paul's probably in the independent Baptist world, and maybe in other worlds, he's one of the better media guys out there that I know of. And so that's a huge tool. And Anderson took advantage of that tool and really promoted what obviously now we know was himself more than I think the issues. I think at first it started out a sincere desire to get the issues out and using Paul. But I think over time the fame hit him, and he got addicted to it.
Yeah, I was very surprised to learn that they weren't Steven Anderson films.
Yeah.
Right, that they were Paul Wittenberger films. He was working on these. He was raising his own money. He was putting it all together and featuring, Steven Anderson, I guess, is a completely different thing than you grew up to know.
It's so bad and frustrating to me because, like this guy, David Cloud, he wrote a booklet called What About Steven Anderson? And then he talks about me. Well, if you want to talk about me, write a book, What About Matt Furse? But it became so convincing to them, even like the David Clouds of the world and the old IFB, that Steven Anderson made up this post-trib, and Steven Anderson came up with this, and we're all just following him. No, I'm older. I'm a lot older than Anderson. I'm older than Tommy. I've been studying the eschatology issue and post-trib versus pre-trib when Anderson was still a teenager with bleached blonde hair. I know for a fact that Anderson is not the one that led me to where I am on my eschatology. I just was glad to see it in quality video being discussed openly and made a documentary by someone like us. That's what I was thrilled about.
With millions and millions and millions of views.
Right.
Right. It's insane. So as you look back, did you ever recognize any kind of early red flags or moments when you started to question the direction Anderson's
Yeah, some of the goofy things, whether you believe or not in precatory prayers or, hoping that Obama has brain cancer or making a big deal about how a man goes to the bathroom, stuff like that. It's like, what in the world are we talking about?
I forgot about that.
Yeah. I mean, and so I'm like, at first it was just kind of like a sideways look, like what was that? And then, but pretty soon, I mean, shortly after marching to Zion, I was like, you know what? I don't want my name associated with this person. I don't think it's about the issue. I think it's becoming about him. And I'm not for sale. I'm an independent Baptist, and I'm not going to lend my name to that anymore. And it was frustrating because I loved having the issue out there to talk about as far as eschatology, but it had turned into someone versus the doctrinal issues.
Well, I know for me, there was a lot of red flags originally. I didn't like him for the longest time. And so it was, I think, 2014 when Marching to Zion came out, but it was 2017 before I ever had anything to do with them, just because I was concerned about a lot of things. But at the same time, because I was learning things, I listened enough, and he started kind of winning me over with himself. But then even then, I had no interest in getting involved with him, joining up with him. But because I started preaching about end times in my church and I was putting it out on YouTube, I ended up getting hammered in my own crowd. And then I kind of became very lonely. But I still had no interest in getting involved with him. But I'm also somebody too, I don't let people push me around. I don't let people, I won't let people put me in a compromising position. But I've always been open to fellowship, get along with people. I remember when Brother Paul invited me to come out to the post-trib conference. I was actually like, I don't know if I want to do that. I was like, I'm for these guys and what they're teaching. I just don't know if I want to be involved with them. But then I'm like, you know what? I might as well, And my thing was, he had been lied about so much that it kind of made it easy for me to think, well, maybe everything's just a lie. Because there are a lot of lies out there about him. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to give him a blank slate because I know so many things they're saying aren't true. So I overlooked a lot of those red flags. And then in 2017, I went out there for the post-trib conference. And I, honestly, still in many ways, when I think of Pastor Anderson and my involvement with him, I mean, I definitely considered him a friend. I enjoyed being around him as a person. And there was a few moments and a few red flags and everything. But yeah, I quickly found out after getting involved with him, this wasn't a great idea. But I will say for me, it wasn't because I really couldn't handle him. I didn't mind some of his antics, and I found a lot of those things entertaining. I just couldn't handle the crowd. The crowd that came with him was just awful, and I got to get out of this mess.
Yeah, and let me just say, thank you for saying that about the lies, because I think it was 2014, Sam Gipp came out with some accusations that were lies, and Sam Gipp drove me towards Anderson because I knew I happened to know. In fact, the night I was there, that Wednesday night, happened to be the night that Sam Gipp was ranting on him out in Idaho, and he said he only has about 30 people. Well, I know he had more than 30 people. I was there that night, and Gipp was unfair and lying. So then that pushed me towards Anderson for a short while. But by the time Prophecy Conference came around, I was already saying, Paul called, and I said, I can't do it. There's something going on here. I don't want to. And like Tommy said, not just him, but some of the goons that were starting to follow him. And and I don't mean to throw everybody under the bus with this, but I remember all of a sudden Anderson came out saying that Sunday schools aren't legitimate,
Right.
and so and it's like, okay, you're an independent Baptist, I'm an independent Baptist, you don't want to have Sunday school in your church, that's fine. But what I was noticing was everybody stopped their Sunday school. And it's like, okay, we're not thinking anymore, we're just following. And I started seeing, tracts are bad. You should never hand out tracts. And when you start seeing everybody like a parrot, it's like, okay, no one's thinking anymore. I can't trust this group. This is not good. And I'm old enough to remember the Jack Hyles Baptist Pope, and I was seeing the Stephen Anderson Baptist Pope. That's what I was starting to see.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But you're right. There was, I got to see it from the outside. I didn't go to any of these conferences or go to the church. I just saw what YouTube had to offer, and it was entertaining. And, my wife and I would look and just laugh about it, but we kind of, it's like, okay, that was funny, and maybe he's just,
But when you live in a town of 2,000 people, like Custer, South Dakota, you can't afford to be connected to a crazy man.
Yeah.
Because that's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt our church. It wasn't about me. It was about our church. And I wanted to keep the testimony for our church and the Lord Jesus, and I did not want Stephen Anderson to be connected to our church. I just realized that's not good.
Well, and even in our church, too, while there was a lot of things we were doing different before, we continued doing those things differently. And I wondered if I would get any grief because we had Sunday school and there was a lot of things we did that he doesn't do in his church. I will say this, he never gave me any kind of grief at all. The followers did. It was the followers that would make a big stink about it. They would come to the church like, I can't believe you guys are doing this in your church. Some of the other pastors, the ones who were just copying him, who were only doing things because that's how Anderson does it, they would be the ones to say something, maybe take a subtle shot at yours or whatever. But Anderson himself didn't do anything like that. And so I always appreciated that about him.
What I quickly realized is there was a lot of people that came out as either they were ordained by him or they were ordained somewhere else, but all their whole doctrine and their whole lives came out of his videos. And so then they just show up on Sunday and then just preach the same sermon or try to act like him or try to be like him. And they're just like, I think that's around the time everybody started calling them Andersonites, right? There was like a whole thing there.
And it's a fair label, really, in some cases. Not for me, but the ones that are sounding like parrots, I can see why they would say that.
Yeah, because you could look at it and say, okay, he's just being funny or whatever, and he's just ranting, and probably he doesn't believe that, and you just move on. But these people took it very seriously to where they're even looking into you guys worse than he would have.
And I don't mind somebody having like a extreme position or even an extreme standard on something if that's what they want to do and be passionate about it. But the thing is, don't expect me to do that same thing.
Right.
And as long as they're not pressuring me, I will give people a ton of grace in areas until they start pressuring me. And Anderson, I will say he never pressured me on anything. He never got on to me for something I was doing, teach wrong, anything like that. But the followers do. And it frankly got annoying. And I know for me personally in my church, I started needing to deal with certain things because I had a lot of people that followed him that were coming to my church, and then things were kind of getting stirred up because of the fact that, I'm not new IFB enough. And so I'm preaching on things that new IFB disagrees with. I'm preaching that people can get saved from a track. People can get saved from reading their Bible and just a lot of the dumb stuff that they teach. And then it was never Anderson, but his goons, the lower pastors, they're all preaching sermons, shooting at me for attacking the new IFB. But it's like, I'm not attacking the new IFB. I'm trying to protect my church from new IFB nut jobs that are in there. And so the fruit of that ministry is astounding to me, and just some of the insanity that comes from it. I don't think Anderson ever sicked the goons on me and told the other preachers, but I think a lot of these preachers did these things thinking it would please Anderson because he was kind of their pope.
Well, yeah, and he garnered a lot of attention, and I think these guys wanted attention and wanted approval from him because then that would probably be in their favor, and he'd maybe pick them to be on the next documentary or something. I don't know. I don't know. It's just human nature to want to look like something. I'll admit it. Being invited to be on Marching to Zion, there's a little bit of wow. I'm going to be on camera, but it was within hours of it being over with, and I'm thinking, I probably should have prayed about that more. Not that I'm ashamed of anything I said or did on that documentary or anything that's on there, but there is a part of you that, being in front of a camera, feeling important, whatever it might be, and I don't know, but there's some real interesting ducks that have followed that crowd, and when they called me and said, you want to be a part of the NIFB, I said, no, I'm not part of the old IFB, so why do I want to be part of the new IFB? I'm not part of a denomination. I'm an independent Baptist, and so I turned that down. I just was thankful that I had at least that discernment, even though I kind of didn't in the beginning.
Well, what would that look like? So there's this thing they're now calling the NIFB, right? What does that look like? Do you want to join? Does that mean, do you want to fall in line, or what does that mean?
Well, when I got involved, I had never even heard the term New IFB. I know there was a Facebook group, a New IFB Facebook group. I don't know when that started, but when I noticed that term, when I first heard that term, it wasn't until the Soul Winning Conference, which I believe that was in 2018. They called it the New IFB Soul Winning Conference. And I know several of us got very nervous about that term. And I remember I had a couple of pastors call me. They're like, "Are you going to this conference?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I'd love to go to the Soul Winning Conference." It was like New IFB. It kind of sounds like a denomination. And, and it was one of those things where I was like, well, I think I see what they're trying to say. I was like, as long as nobody's trying to tell me what to do, as long as nobody's trying to tell me how to run my church, I'm not going to make a big deal about it. And I did. I think because I had been so shut out from a lot of fellowship, I was just wanting some fellowship. So I overlooked a lot of stuff. Either way, I was just like, oh well. But I never fully embrace that, is like, because again, I'm IFB, but I'm not a part of a denomination. So if I just go to a New IFB conference, I guess that doesn't really make me a denomination either. So you find excuses around it, but you can be IFB and nobody automatically gives you a pope. Nobody automatically knows everything about you. New IFB, it's a little different. It's a little too exclusive.
Yeah,
and
the club.
Definitely don't want the label.
So if you could pinpoint it, was there a specific event that made you say, okay, now I'm distancing myself? And then what did that look like, personally and spiritually for you guys?
I know when it was for me, because obviously there were a lot of red flags, but I had a lot of hope that things were going to get better with the crowd, because around the time I got involved with the New IFB, you had guys like Pastor Joe Major that got involved. There were some other old IFB guys that were getting involved that were good, balanced guys. And so I was hoping that it was going to become more normal and less crazy. And a lot of stuff started happening, and you kind of started having some splits, but it was kind of some of the crazier ones going away. But then the good people started getting, rocks thrown at them and stuff. And I know what the very pivotal moment for me was when they went after Pastor Boyle and Pastor Major after the King James conference that they had. I'm like, if we can't even get along with guys like Pastor Boyle and Pastor Major, then this is just stupid. I wasn't going to and so I didn't officially break fellowship or anything, but I knew this wasn't going to last. And I think that was in 2020 when all of that went down. And it did. It just started kind of slowly falling apart for me. More kind of one after another was getting mad at me, breaking fellowship. And but I knew, I was like, there's no hope of reforming this crowd, because if we're nailing these guys, then there's no hope.
You would think with the more people, the more accountability, but there was none.
Yeah, that's what I hope, because there were old IFB guys getting involved, and so I was hoping they would make it more normal. I was wanting Pastor Furse to get more involved with the new IFB because I thought he would help bring some normalness to the crowd.
Yeah.
But again, he was older than me, and he
knew better.
Yeah, he had already kind of written it off. But because I was like, we need guys like Pastor Furse involved in this to help make it normal. But it never had a chance.
But I have never been tech savvy. I have never been great with computers, and certainly not video and audio and all that stuff. And Tommy's way better than I am on it. And the one thing I feared about Steven Anderson was the video. It was like a club because he could use it against you easily. And me personally, if he wants to beat on me, that's fine. But like I said earlier, my church, my town, it can't handle that. I don't need that for them. And so I just want nothing to do with it. I just started backing away quickly. But I still watched Tommy because I thought he sounded normal. Joe and Brother Boyle, I still thought that those guys. And so someone sent me the whole set of the prophecy conference, and I watched everything. And those are the guys that I really enjoyed and gleaned from. Joe did a great job on the Schofield stuff. And so I appreciate it, but I realized sooner or later you guys are going to have to learn what I'm seeing, and they did, and it started unraveling. So for me, it was 2015, like I said, that I was already backpedaling quickly, and my own book came out that didn't even totally agree with Marching to Zion, and it came out, and I knew that Pastor Anderson wouldn't want it sold in conjunction with what he was doing because it didn't agree with who the whore is and all that. So. But I was glad, and I was glad when he publicly said that I wasn't a soul winner, because that gave me like the official separation,
Yeah,
and Tommy was there, and I am, I'm a soul winner. I mean, people get saved and baptized in our church, and I'm not a Calvinist, and maybe I don't do it the way they do it in Phoenix, but that might not necessarily be a bad thing either.
The two greatest days in the new IFB are the day you get in and the day you get out. In fact, I remember...
And I was never in, but I officially got kicked out, so that was good.
I remember when they had the famous Sam Gipp conference where they went after Anderson. That was kind of when I got involved with him, and I won't even go into the long story of how that got me involved with him. But I remember, I let Anderson know, hey, I'm on your side in this. I support you on this. And I remember he made a video announcing all these churches that were standing with him. And I remember... he mentioned our church in there, and I remember being excited and a little nervous too, because I'm like, I'm really going to get creamed now. But at the same time, while I was excited then, I remember the day that I had a phone conversation with him where we officially broke fellowship. It was so liberating, and because I did consider him a friend, and he still gets lied about, and I still don't like when he gets lied about. I've had preachers say stuff to me. It's like, well, yeah, you know this? And I was like, no, that's not true. It's like, if you want to know what's actually wrong, I'll tell you, but don't make stuff up. And I still don't like that. But I remember it was a kind of a relief to know, all right, I don't need to feel like accountable for this guy anymore. I don't need to defend him, because I wanted to defend him, but it got too difficult because he kept doing crazier things and a lot of dumb stuff. And so it was a very happy day for me when that happened. And I officially went and unfriended him, and I scrubbed everything I possibly could from the internet that had a connection to me and him, because I was always being accused too of like trying to use him to gain a following. And even in the last several weeks, I've had several people tell me, the Kool-Aid drinking type, like, we wouldn't even know who you were if it wasn't for Pastor Anderson. And my thought is always, I know. And I wish you never would have figured out who I was, because you're crazy.
But whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And a friend of mine used to say the gospel light attracts some very strange bugs. And, when the dust settles, the truth remains. We don't worship the personality. We shouldn't. And we just appreciate the truth. And I compared Anderson to Peter Ruckman, because Peter Ruckman deserves credit for raising awareness of the Greek text and the King James issue and its importance. However, Ruckman is one of the greatest blights to the King James issue. I think Anderson deserves credit for making the eschatology an issue now, and yet at the same time he is a great blight to it as well, because people can call it an Andersite doctrine, which is incorrect, but they can call it that and convince people of that. So we just have to try to separate the personalities from the issues, and it's hard to do because we're humans.
So, yeah, speaking of that, what kind of backlash did you get after, now that people are getting to know Steven Anderson? Now there's all these films. You're in one, you're in a few, right? I think. And what kind of backlash have you gotten now? I mean, do you just not...
From the new IFB side or from the old IFB side?
I guess from everybody, because on one hand, you're going to get backlash because you're out. But then on the other hand, you might get backlash because you're on Marching to Zion, and that's a Steven Anderson thing, right?
Yeah.
Kind of viewpoint.
So for me, this would have been 10 years ago. Marching to Zion's about 10 years old. I was a celebrity in the world of the nuts, of the goofballs, that I didn't really want to be. And I was a nut to all the old IFB and all the people that I knew in the past. But personally, what happened is we were involved in a independent Baptist group of churches that got together and did summer camp. I was removed from any involvement with that, basically kicked out. I've been kicked out of more than one camp, more than one independent Baptist fellowship out in the West, Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota. And it's because of my eschatology. And I've never gone to camp and talked about eschatology. Who talks about eschatology at a kids' camp anyway? And they even said, you can't be there. I mean, you can send your kids, but you can't come. One camp won't even let us send their kids. I mean, and one pastor friend said, seriously, we take in Mormons. we take in Catholics. And this guy's eschatology is different, and you won't let his kids go to camp. That define insecurity without defining insecurity. I mean, really, what are you saying? You're saying that you're so insecure about your doctrine that you can't even have someone around that disagrees with it. So yeah, we saw that happening. We saw, I mentioned David Cloud. He mentioned me as if I'm an Andersonite, and he's wrong, and he's lying when he does that. He even mentioned my dad in that. And then I'd go to my alma mater, and everybody just give me sideways looks, and I purposely showed up. I show up once in a while, just let them know my skin's not green. I still have standards. I still can, my kids are better than some of theirs. But anyway, I just want to show up and let them know I'm not a freak. I'm not crazy. And they know by now. I'm not an Andersonite. But they still don't want to talk to me because it's public and they might be seen talking to me. And it's because, honestly, we're a bunch of followers. The word independent is such a fraudulent term for most of the independent Baptists. They're not independent. How many missionaries are independent?
Right. Yeah.
Right? And how many quote-unquote independent Baptist pastors are really independent? Because they know they won't be invited to preach at anybody's conference. They know they won't be invited to, be flown across the country and wined and dined and preach in their chapel or whatever. And yeah, so the whole independent Baptist label is a real joke to me because there's very few independent Baptists, I think.
At least they're networked, right?
Yeah.
In some way.
They have to have a network. And if that's the case, they're not independent. And that goes for the new IFB too. Mm-hmm. They're proving that too.
Right 100%. Now. Yeah, for me, when I was post-trib and, anti-Zionist for 3 years in the circles that I ran with, word was kind of getting out. And so everybody, but I was still allowed in fellowship in different places. People put up with me. It wasn't until I got involved with Anderson that things really changed. And when I got involved with Anderson, people acted like I joined a cult or something like that. I did have multiple preachers that called me up and ripped me up pretty good. I will say 100% of those guys I'm still very good friends with because I can handle somebody who will rip me up in love and that's what they did. They were genuinely concerned. And so I'm still friends with those guys. A lot of people just kind of gave me the silent treatment, wouldn't return phone calls. I got uninvited from some things that I was involved with before. And so I was very lonely for a while, but thankfully, because of the fact that the old IFB, whenever they have a falling out with you, they don't start making YouTube videos, calling you out and all that kind of stuff. It has made it so over time, people have observed, because it's been 10 years now since I've changed on these things, and they've seen our ministry, they've seen my family and what I'm producing in my ministry and family. And so people have backed off, and a lot of fences have been mended. And, and people are still nervous with me. They know I'm not involved with Anderson anymore, and that helps. But I also am very outspoken about what I believe, and it's different than them. And like he said, IFB is anything but independent. They're very political. And so most IFB, well, I don't want to just make a broad generalization, but let me say many people in the IFB, their doctrinal positions are more motivated by politics than scripture and study. And so whenever somebody comes along and they're saying something different, they've got a different agenda, it really freaks them out. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond. And it's very hard to find an actual Baptist who actually wants to engage and is willing to look into the issue. They are out there, and I am friends with many of those guys, and we have a mutual respect for each other. But if you are holding a different position on something like eschatology that we should be able to be different on, because their position is only political, all they know is you're different, and therefore they're concerned.
They're scared.
And they're scared.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're not sure they want to be associated with you because you're different, because we're independent, right?
Right. You're actually independent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, it's goofy. But there was a pastor called me last week, and you can hear the fear in his voice. I don't know him. I know people that he knows, but he called and he said, I was reading 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and I know that verse 1, 2, 3, it says the day of Christ will not come until after the man of sin be revealed and the falling away happens. And he said, I know that pre-trib has problems. He said, but I couldn't really understand it. And then a friend of mine gave me your book about Israel, and it's starting to fall into place. And I'm seeing all this about Schofield. He said, Pastor, what do I do? Because my church has been taught this dispensational stuff for years. And I said, just take it one step at a time. I gave him some passages that I would start with. And then I said, in the bottom line, you're going to find out who is loyal to the Bible and who's loyal to dispensationalism. And so there's a great fear there. But this is a man who wants to be right with God. And that's what an independent Baptist should be. It's just right with God, and who cares what everybody else thinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the best things that happened to me in the old IFB before I got involved in the new IFB, and it happened even more in the new IFB. But when you are from the independent fundamental Baptist world, when you've listened to these preachers, you've gone to the meetings your whole life, you fear being the negative illustration. You fear being the guy called out at the big meetings and things like that. And the thought of hearing these preachers get up and calling you out by name and listening to all the preachers amen and all that, it's a terrifying thought. I mean, it literally paralyzes people in a lot of ways. Any pastors out there watching this, let me just say, it's not that big a deal. I've had it happen to me on both sides. It's not that big of a deal, but it is. I remember when I first started putting my sermons on YouTube, I had seen videos before of somebody getting debunked and somebody getting called out, and because they said something stupid. I was like, man, what if I say something stupid? I can't even imagine what I would do if there was some video out there on YouTube, where somebody exposing me and showing me saying something stupid. It's not that big of a deal. You just really need one thing, just a little humility, and if you have a little humility, you're going to be okay that not everybody thinks you're great. And if you're wrong and you have a little bit of humility, you can just admit you were wrong. It's not that hard. And so I determined when I first started putting stuff online, I was like, all right, what I'm just going to do, if I get called out, if I say something stupid, I'm just going to admit it. But, when you're from the preacher world, when you've been in the ministry, it is a big part of your life. I don't think a lot of people realize, how much many pastors are kind of dependent on that fellowship. And these meetings, they mean a lot. They really recharge your batteries. And getting told not to come back to something like that, it really hurts people. But I will say for me, because of the fact, one of the things that helped me get through it, even the people who had kind of cut off fellowship for a while, they had already proven to me that they actually loved me and cared about me. I knew that. So for me, I knew it was politics. And so I didn't take it. I wouldn't allow myself to take it personal. I was like, this is politics. And so I knew my intentions were right, and I believed I was right when it came to these things. And so I didn't tell myself, these people hate me and they're just terrible. No, I believe they loved me. I think they'd prove that, but I also believe that they were very motivated by politics. And I don't want to allow that to influence me.
So you mentioned that when you started getting involved with Anderson, people thought you were going to be part of a cult, right? Which is what it looks like on the outside a lot. Now, being in it, coming out of it, the things that are happening today, would you call it that? And then what makes it seem like that?
I still wouldn't call it a cult. However, it has many within it that want it to be a cult. It attracts many of the types of people who join cults. So it definitely has cult-like tendencies a lot, and it's really showing right now, like never before. But part of that is because all this stuff that's being exposed, it is driving out all the normal people that were in the new IFB, and it's only leaving the cult types in there. So I think it's quickly becoming one. And honestly, if it keeps going, and it absolutely shouldn't, I think people are starting to realize the new IFB is just not even a thing anymore. I think we can just go ahead and officially call it. It's gone. It's done. Yeah. It absolutely is done. It doesn't exist. It died, and it needed to. And I think there's going to be some churches that were a part of it. They're going to go on being independent Baptist churches, and that's good. But let me tell you, if the new IFB continues being a thing, I think it'll be real easy to classify it a cult within 6 months because it's gotten so crazy.
Yeah, I mean, because it looks like it, because it's all about one guy, and then you get excommunicated, or even if he says something negative against someone, suddenly they all realize, oh, we better not talk to that person. Mm-hmm. If we talk to that person, he's going to call us out on the pulpit, and it's going to be all over YouTube, and he's going to kick us out in front of everyone. All those things that he's used to doing, right?
Yeah, and I know old IFB that are doing that. They just don't use the internet to do it, but they're doing it. I mean, like I said, my alma mater, they're desperate to show successful graduates, but they won't let me preach behind their pulpit. No. Am I a scandal? Do I have children that are bad? No, it's just I don't hold to what they teach, and that makes me a bad person. Well, you know what? I'm guilty of studying the Bible after I left college,
Right.
And apparently they're not. They're just following the what they were taught way back when. But 100 years ago, eschatology was not a separation issue for Baptists. You could be, amillennial, post-millennial, whatever, and still fellowship amongst each other. In fact, the fundamentals has Schofield in there a couple times, but also has Philip Morrow in there. The fundamentals that were written over 100 years ago. But today, the old IFB act like anybody that's anti-dispensational or anti-Zionist or doesn't worship Israel and is not pre-trib. They act like we are just heretics from another planet.
Right.
And that's just a fraud. They're just being lazy. They're just being selfish. They want to play golf. They don't want to go back and study. And our churches are so, especially down in the South, they're so locked into pro-Israel that these pastors, like the one that called me last week, even he's honest, but these pastors don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole because it'll be political suicide for them. They might lose their job as a pastor, friends, family. There's a lot of intermarrying within the independent Baptists as well. So if your wife's dad's a pastor, then you got all that to deal with. All that kind of stuff goes into it.
Yeah.
But it goes back to what I said. We're not independent Baptists. We're not. We are not independent Baptists, most of them.
No.
I think I am, but I'm very dependent on God, and I don't want to brag like I'm always independent because I'm a human, but I think I've demonstrated that I am an independent Baptist, and I don't need the internet to fund my church either, which is another subject of Anderson. My church is funded by my church, the offering plate. and I don't have to be a clown on the internet to raise funds or to generate income to pay for things. And I think that's the way God planned it.
Yeah.
His local church takes care of its own, it's independent.
Right. Well, me and Pastor Furse, we're never going to be popular in the Baptist world because, one, we're never going to pretend independent fundamental Baptists are independent. And we're going to continue, too, pointing out the fact that they are, let's not pretend they're not completely man-centered. In fact, if you go on one of the, there's a KJV Baptist church directory, and you look at all the different churches, one of the things they have to kind of identify a lot of them are names like Anderson, Ruckman, Hiles, and things like that. And the reality is you can go into most independent fundamental Baptist churches and figure out in about 5 seconds what kind of one that you are in. And it's typically very man-centered or centered around a certain college. And so because of that, like I said, proof that people's positions are political and not scriptural, you can often tell by what they divide over. And again, eschatology, it has never been something that people have divided over until probably more like the 70s. And, proof of that is, I like to ask people sometime, give me scripture to show where we should divide when it comes to eschatology. Now, they can't do that. Now, there are areas in the scripture where we see them dividing over what we would call eschatology. You had those who were saying the resurrection was past, overthrowing the faith of some. Oh, guess what? Pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, none of us believe that the resurrection is past. We're all the same on that kind of thing. Whenever it would say, let no man deceive you, even in the post-trib crowd, often they'll say, well, that means, don't let people deceive you about the pre-trib rapture, or don't let people deceive about the post-trib rapture. No, hang on, time out. Both times we see that, the thing it warned of was a coming man of sin, someone else saying he's Christ. Guess what? The pre-tribbers, they don't believe in accepting a man who says he's Christ on earth. Post-tribbers were the same. So we ought to be able to get along. And then even things like the millennium. When it comes to a lot of the eschatology, it's not as clear as people think it is. But one of the things that happened to me, and this was very revealing to me, any preacher that would talk to me and get on my case, and there were several, all they want to do is talk about Anderson, which I kept telling people, at first, I don't know Anderson. I have nothing to do with Anderson. I don't want to have anything to do with Anderson. I said I eventually got involved because I gave him a blank slate because I got tired of the lies. But then, two, when I'm trying to talk to them, they're just name dropping all the people that stand with them when it comes to eschatology. I mean, it's like, well, I need names more like Paul and Jesus, not the names of these other people. So they're very man-centered. It's very political. And so because of that kind of thing, people are going to freak out. And if anybody thinks the new IFB is not man-centered, then they are not familiar with the new IFB. It is very centered around Stephen Anderson, and that's sad. When I was making excuses for the term, to me, it was about the doctrine. Because when it came to the doctrines associated with the new IFB, yeah, okay, I guess I am new IFB with that. But it became very obvious. I remember they got really upset by a sermon that Pastor Grayson Fritz had preached at that time that upset a lot of people, where he was calling out legitimate foolishness in the new IFB, specifically to the sorry kids that they were turning out. And I remember Anderson put out a video, and he was saying, we are the new IFB. And that was kind of going around social media and stuff. And I'm like, okay. To me, this has officially defined what the new you guys, since you made up the term, you can make up the definition. Yeah. And it's the people. It's not even just the churches. It's an internet community. A lot of the people saying we are the new IFB, a lot of people who identify new IFB don't even go to new IFB churches. It's a people that are mainly united online, and they have different satellite locations that they call churches where they meet together. And it's just like, I don't want to be a part of this community. So yeah, I might have doctrine that's very similar to yours, but I am not a part of this crowd.
Right.
I am not new IFB.
Right. Yeah, and surprising to maybe some listening, I honestly don't care if someone's pre-trib as long as they're honest and sincere and they're following the word. that kind of stuff can get straightened out later. We support 45 missionaries, and they've never been told they have to agree with my eschatology. In fact, the members of my church don't have to agree with my eschatology. They have to listen to it, but they don't have to agree with it to be a member. And that's because I'm not insecure, and I don't think it's that big of a deal. I love what Brother McMurtry said a couple of years ago. He said, I wish the old fundamentals, the old independent Baptists, were as deaf about scandals and cover-ups and hanky-panky that goes on behind closed doors as they are about us who are different in our eschatology.
Yeah.
And because it's such a hypocrisy there. They're covering up their kids that are fornicating and all that, and it's old and new both. But then they act like we're this or that. A year ago, I had a friend of mine went to the same college I went to. I had him come in. He presented his work. We took him on. And then about 3 or 4 months later, he calls me and he said, listen, I have got to ask you to drop me. He said, because I'm getting grief. He said, I've got to ask you to drop me. And I just shook my head, but I believe it. I believe he's getting grief from others who just hate me, apparently. And here we are sending him to go out to the foreign field to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, but he can't take our money because we think that there might be a difference in the way we look at 7 years of future. And it's just amazing. It's just crazy. But that's quote unquote independent Baptist today.
Well, and the reason another reason they're like that too, they don't, because they've, if they've never actually studied out their eschatology, and a lot of them have told me, I'm pre-trib because that's what I've been taught, that's what I've been told. They've never actually studied it out. Because of that, they're not going to understand how big of a deal it should be. When you have actually studied out the issue and you get it, then all of a sudden you're able to accurately judge, okay, how much is this going to affect things in my personal life, being different on eschatology? How much is this going to affect things in my church, the way I run my ministry? And when you actually understand the issue, you do realize, while I enjoy it, while I enjoy talking about it, and I'm known by a lot of people because of that, because I have a podcast where I talk about prophecy, but I do that just because I enjoy it. That's not the focal point of my ministry. My church is the focal point of my ministry. That's something I do for fun because I enjoy it. And that's why a lot of people know me, but it is not the most important thing to me. Being a good Christian, being solid on the gospel, those things are much more important to me. And I love being independent so much. Again, any Baptist that's out there that's worried about just getting kicked out of the club, it is so liberating to be exactly what God calls to be, independent Baptist. In fact, it almost motivates me to want to have people in my podcast that'll offend everybody, just to get all the denomination type people away from me. Not want to have, so I'll go and I'll get my pictures taken with Mark Wards and people like that we're not supposed to just to freak those people out, because I don't want to ever be a part of some denomination. I don't want people thinking because I preach for somebody or I had them preach for me, I just agree with everything that they do and I'm for everything they stand for. And if I do fellowship with people, it's just because I genuinely like them. It's not about seeing who I can get to go along with my agenda and make as much like me as possible. And I tell that to pre-tribbers all the time that I'm friends with. It's like, if I'm your friend now, it's because I like you and how you are now, not because of what I think I can get you to be. Right. And I don't need to change them. If they want to change, great, but at the same time, they don't have to.
So where does a guy like Steven Anderson even come from? I know that there's been some questions about his ordination out there. He attributes a lot of he says that the greatest teacher to him was Jack Hyles. Can we discuss some of that? What about Jack Hyles?
Well, I think I don't know where he first learned of Jack Hyles. I think he came from Steve Nichols. Is that kind of where he came from, Pastor Nichols? Mm-hmm. And there's controversy as to whether or not he actually was ordained or not. And I think Pastor Nichols says he wasn't. And now his sons are saying he wasn't. Is that right? But yeah, recently within the last 3 weeks, Anderson said that he basically invoked Jack Hyles because of the issues with his children, and pointed to Jack Hyles. So, well, he had issues too. So, see, it's okay. Basically, leave me alone. And I just think that there's a lot of connections there. I think that my observation, I said this to a pastor years ago, my observation is that he is pretty much criticized every Baptist icon out there, from Charles Spurgeon to Paul Chappell and everybody in between, except for Jack Hyles. And I think it's because he wants to be like Jack Hyles. He wants to be that Baptist pope, and that's what Jack Hyles was. Even to this day, I've been to a conference in just the last few years, and they're still talking about Jack Hyles. The guy's been dead for over 20 years. And so Jack Hyles was the old IFB Baptist Pope, and I think Stephen Anderson was hoping to be the new IFB Baptist Pope.
Well, you know what, we've been saying over and over again that Baptists are very man-centered, and when people get man-centered like that, that's a result of a lack of faith. That's being carnal. When you're saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, it's God that giveth the increase. And God has greatly used men. I'm not a Jack Hyles defender, nor am I a Jack Hyles hater. I never knew him personally. I cannot deny many of the great things that were accomplished through him. But when I see that and I hear some of the, I do think there was some fault with the cover-ups and things like that. But when I look back at Jack Hyles and I hear about the great things and I hear about the faults, what it does with me is it just shows me what God can do with the man. I'm more impressed by God than the man. And often, because of our carnality, when God uses an individual, we get overly focused on the individual rather than the God that's using them. What God wants to do, he said he does this. He uses the foolish to confound the wise. And so when God takes somebody like a Jack Hyles and he uses them in a great way, that's supposed to inspire the rest of us to want to yield to God. But in our carnality, what we often do is we get ultra focused on the man, because it's a lot easier to look at a man, just like back in the old days, before Christ, it was a lot easier to focus on an idol, rather than, the God of heaven. And it's carnality, plain and simple. And when we make idols, whether they be a graven image or whether we make a man as an idol, God's going to show us what they're actually made out of. And then what do we do in our carnality? It's like, well, they either had to be all good or all bad. And so even right now in the new IFB, many are perplexed right now, because to them, their salvation is all about Anderson. Their doctrine is all about Anderson.
That's all they know.
That's all they know. And I believe these people are saved, but unfortunately, they've not grown. They're still babes in Christ. And in the new IFB world, I do believe they have done a very good job in preaching the gospel, promoting soul winning, but they've not done a good job in helping people grow. And so because of that, there's a lot of babes in Christ. Well, in Corinthians, the way the babes in Christ manifested themselves was by associating themselves with men. And so now what we're seeing too is a lot of these people are flopping out of the new IFB. What are they doing? They're just embracing all the doctrine of another man. You know why? Because they never grew to have a relationship with God. And they did make too big a deal about a man. And God has now showed us what he actually is. He's a man. And what this has caused me to do is this has caused me to look at and just think, wow, if God was able to use somebody like him, maybe he could use somebody like me as well. It just makes me want to be used of God more. I think of Pastor Anderson almost like a Samson, where Samson was a very flawed individual, but yet God had a will he wanted to accomplish. God wanted to defeat the Philistines, and God got that done through Samson, but it didn't really end that great for Samson. And
Samson died a lot younger than he probably could have.
Exactly. And I think if Pastor Anderson, I believe God has been very gracious to him. And I believe had he humbled himself, I believe had he gotten some things right, then I think God would have used him in a much greater way. And now to see the way things are going, it's horrible. And so I don't need to figure out how to cancel out everything or that he did in the past. I don't need to do that. I believe God used him, but I believe God was very gracious with him, but I also believe he refused to repent. He got stubborn, and now it's ending bad. And I do think he's giving the doctrine that he has stood for a black eye.
Yeah, there's a lot of people I like the way that you said a Samson, because lately people are like, no, he's like Job. He's like the greatest man alive. Yeah. All these things, and you can tell that the ones that believe that and think that are the babes in Christ, right? And lately I think his Pastor Shelley's talking about there's spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is happening, and that's why all this is going down, and we need to support him. When I think, yeah, maybe you're right, but it happened way back when he was doing the abuse and doing the things wrong, and he allowed that in his own house.
I think King Saul is another example too. At one time Saul was a humble guy, but there came a point where he just became very rebellious and very angry at everybody and very, very agitated in his own personal life, to the point where he's hating his own son, and throwing javelins at people. So, but it just goes to show that you can't worship a man. And there's no doubt in my mind that Jack Hyles was worshipped back in the day and still is, and Anderson was being worshipped and is too. I can only imagine there are people out there who maybe have followed Anderson all their Christian life, and they don't know what to do now. And here's what they need to do. They need to find a local church and stop expecting that pastor to be Stephen Anderson, and stop trying to demand everything to be, and to just let God teach them. Because what they're going to find out is there's good things to learn in other churches that are going to be different, that they needed to hear that they didn't get. You have a carnal babe who knows how to talk to someone about soul winning, but doesn't know how to raise their family, doesn't know how to operate their marriage, doesn't even understand what local church really is. They're a mile wide and a shallow and an inch deep. You know what I mean? And so I think there's just a lot of people out there that need to be pointed to the local church. And oh, by the way, don't come to Matt Furse or Tommy McMurtry. We don't want to be the next pope.
Right.
And I really don't want you moving to my town because you think that this is the next kingdom building. We're not doing that. I think we're supposed to spread out and preach the gospel. Somebody years ago said that Christians are a lot like cow manure. When you pile them all together, they stink up the place, but when you spread them out, they do some good. And I think we got to remember that. We got to realize that a lot of times we get together and we really stink up the place. We just need to spread out and do our job, and not try to build a kingdom.
Yeah, where you're called to be at. Right?
There's already a kingdom we're supposed to be building, and that's the eternal kingdom, not our manly, fleshly, earthly, man-centered kingdom.
Yeah, everybody's got to stop looking for the next guy that they're going to follow.
That's right.
Get into, I have people call me all the time, email me wanting advice and different things. You need somebody who knows you personally. That's why we have the local church. I want to help people online, and I try to give advice, but I'm going to be giving very general, vague things based on the little information these people give me. I cannot, no matter how smart you think I am, because I got a YouTube channel or something like that, because you like my preaching.
And I'm not smart because I don't have a YouTube channel.
But I am not going to be able to help you more than a pastor that knows you personally, that in the church that you are attending physically. Everybody needs that. And unfortunately, Pastor Anderson has freaked people out so much about churches with Sunday schools and nurseries, and your kids are all going to get molested if you take them there, that a lot of people just, they can't bring themselves to go to these places. But it's like, this is what, they need to get in a church that focuses more on holy living, being a good husband and father, and things like that, more than eschatology. And yet, it's going to be annoying when you go and you hear the pre-trib stuff and the pro-Israel stuff. That's annoying, and we've all been trained to freak out when we hear that stuff. But you know what? I would rather hear a guy get up and preach a pre-trib sermon than a guy to get up and act like child abuse isn't really a thing. Or that it's okay to beat your wife or something like that, or that it's not really abuse unless you knock out a tooth or an eye. It's like, listen, that's insanity.
I've rebuked some people over the phone who called me and said, "Well, there just isn't any good churches around."
Yeah,
I said, what do you mean by that? Well, they're all pre-trib. That doesn't mean they're not a good church. That doesn't mean you're not going to get fed. That doesn't mean there's not a lot there that you can hear from. And it's just an excuse and a cop-out. And I really get upset, and they know it. I chew them out. Come on, that's not an excuse. And so, yeah, it's been unhealthy to have this internet pastor mentality. It's unhealthy. We started live streaming during COVID. I do think there's a benefit to it. I do think that there are people out there who legitimately don't have a good church, but I don't consider myself their pastor. And they know that I am constantly telling them, you need to find a church or start a church. But this cop-out that, well, they don't agree with everything, come on, that's garbage.
Yeah. So what were your initial reactions when you first heard the allegations of child abuse and spousal abuse? I've talked to people, and some of them are like, oh, yeah, I could see it a mile away. And I've talked to others where they're just they're like, I can't even believe this happened.
For me, it's one of those things where obviously I had no idea. I knew something was wrong in the home. I mean, I think that's been apparent for a long time. But at the same time, because of his personality, because of the way he preaches, because of behavior that I've even observed, when I heard the kids telling these stories, it was one of those deals where I didn't want to believe it. But yet at the same time, my gut told me they're telling the truth. And so I even though I had broken fellowship with Pastor Anderson a long time ago, I never hated the guy. I still don't hate the guy. Our wives continue to be in friends. And so when I had originally seen Isaac's interview, I think I kind of brushed it off. He's probably exaggerating a little bit. But then when I heard John's interview, I knew that I knew he was probably telling the truth. And it was after John's interview, I did the Facebook post because, again, I was very torn because I didn't want to believe it, but I'm like, you know what? Either way you spin it, he's disqualified. If half the stuff these guys are saying is true, he's disqualified. And then even if everything they're saying is a lie, the fact that his 4 oldest kids have just immediately, and then one who's still a minor and supposed to be in the home is literally a runaway, there's no question as to whether or not he's qualified. So if Pastor Anderson is telling the truth about his kids, he's not qualified. If his kids are telling the truth, he's not qualified, no matter which way you spin it. But I will say this, I tried to convince myself his kids were just exaggerating. I knew it was probably bad, but I didn't want to think like disqualifying bad. But then after I talked to Pastor Anderson, I had sent him a message telling him how I felt that he needed to step down. He never responded to it or anything. But then after I did the Facebook post the next day, he ended up calling me up. After I talked to him, I knew the boys were telling the truth.
Why was that? What was that conversation like?
It was kind of weird. I thought he was going to really chew me out. I've heard all the stories about him calling people up and screaming at him, cussing him out. He did not do that with me. He's never done that to me. I will say that. But the conversation, it started out really good. It started to get heated a few different times. But because he was telling me that the things that they were saying were exaggerations and some of them were outright lies. And when I would ask about certain things, he was playing word games with me, and that bothered me. That he needed to play word games, and then he kind of went into this, hypothetical. Well, suppose that I was doing that. What I mean, why would I even be unqualified biblically? What verse do you have? And, and I'm using verses like, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, cherishing her and all. I'm giving him those things. Well, you're just adding that to it. That doesn't explicitly say, that you can't spank her or whatever. And then he brought up the whole idea of and he's like, what if I gave you a verse that shows that you can corporal punish a woman? And I'm like, what? And then he gave me a verse about a maidservant and basically saying it was okay if you didn't knock out her eye or tooth. And I was like, that is crazy. I said, first off, that's a maidservant. That's not even your wife. But are we seriously going to go that far? I couldn't believe he even said that. And
let me just stop here and say, see why I didn't want him connected with
Yeah.
me a long time ago? I mean,
Well-
I just knew we're going down this road.
And I still didn't make the connection right away. But when I got off the phone after that conversation, I was outside walking around, and I was like, I'm trying to make sense, because I've always enjoyed a lot of his teaching. But what he told me about the maidservant and the iron, that was so weird to me. And all of a sudden, it finally hit me, because he kept playing word games with me. And all of a sudden, I now understood when he's saying, I've never laid a hand on my wife. Okay. Obviously, we know he means what he meant by that, because every man's touched their wife. He meant in an unbiblical way. And so for him, it's biblical as long as you don't knock out an eye or a tooth.
As long as both her eyes are still in her head.
And when I realized that, I was like, holy cow, his boys were telling the truth. He has done that stuff to his wife. And it really floored me. And I remember I told my wife, because we argued about some passages. We argued about the whole marital rape thing and everything. And he had some insults. He kind of threw some insults at me about that. And I remember I told my wife, I was like, one thing I know about Anderson is anytime you have a theological argument with him, he's preaching about it the next service. Yeah. I said, that would be crazy if after all these accusations, he goes and preaches the stuff that he told me this Sunday. I was like, there's no way he's going to do it. There's no way that would be very foolish. Well, he did.
He did.
Now, here's why. Okay. Here's why. And I know this. It's because he knew about the recording that John did with Jonathan Shelley, where Jonathan Shelley confirmed and basically made it clear that Pastor Anderson had admitted to doing some of these things. And so Anderson knew that audio was out there and was going to be coming out. So he had to preach that, to do like a preemptive damage control. Because if he would have preached that after a video comes out with Pastor Shelley admitting that he's used an electrical cord on his kids and his wife, but it was consensual, it was going to look really bad. So he did it before, and it made him look worse. And honestly, his preaching in the last month has done more than anything to convince me his kids are telling the truth.
Oh, yeah.
And again, I didn't want to believe it. I did not want to believe it. He convinced me his kids were telling the truth more than his kids did.
Well, for me, I'm not nearly as connected. Tommy is much more connected to his wife.
Yeah.
My wife, me, and I've said this before, I'll say it again. Nobody in my church even knows the Anderson drama is going on right now.
Stop bragging.
I mean, seriously. I know I'm bragging, but it's true. Nobody even knows that I'm sitting down having this conversation. They don't care. If you ask them, it'd be like, Anderson who? Oh, that guy? Oh. But they just,
obviously. Yeah.
They just, we've just never allowed this personality to become a big deal. And I'm thankful for that. One of the few smart things maybe I ever did. But even then, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I saw maybe on Facebook or somewhere that there was this chat room with the boys.
Yeah.
And there was some real vulgar stuff going on. And I know, I knew Tommy, so I said, hey, and he said, well, my boys weren't involved, but yeah, there's some, and I said, well, all right, par for the course. And then, what was it, 8 months ago, Isaac, I don't know how long it's been, but I saw this thing with one of the older ones, Isaac. And so again, I reached out to Tommy and said, "This is not good either." And so just the two of us, this isn't looking good. Well, then last month there was the other boy, Jonathan, and then there was the older one, Solomon, and then there was the daughter. And the three boys, there's F-bombs coming out of their mouth. There's a lot of stuff that's troubling in some of them. Not all, but it makes you wonder about their spiritual condition. But the girl, Miriam, my heart goes out to her.
Absolutely.
And if she listens to this, she is welcome to come if she needs a place to learn what a real local church looks like, and to get herself straightened out and just understand, what a loving church family is supposed to look like. And I'm not saying that's not an invitation to the boys, but it seems like she is genuinely wanting this to be right without a rebellious spirit, in my opinion. And that's just from watching what she said on that one original video. But yeah, I agree. If your kids are lying, you're disqualified because you've raised 4 kids in a row that have literally turned against you and said the most crazy lies in the world. Or if they're telling the truth, that's even worse, and you're disqualified.
Yeah, I thought when the original interviews came out and it was Isaac and then John, like you said, and then Miriam goes on, and immediately I was like, oh, man, I hope people from that church watch this, but I don't think they will.
Well, let me say this. What kind of man, especially a pastor, beats his wife and kids with an extension cord? It's hard for us to imagine somebody doing something that horrible. Well, let me tell you exactly the kind of man that would do it. The same kind of man that would do the type of stuff these kids are talking about is a man whose 17-and-a-half-year-old runaway daughter, when going on a podcast talking about horrific abuse that she's experienced, almost in tears, would get up in his church and be like, I don't know, Pastor Anderson, but that Miriam interview, that's the one that got me. How does that not affect him? Listen, when the Miriam interview definitely, touched me and touched a nerve with me. And the fact that it didn't with him, his own daughter, and listen, even if she's lying about him, I can't imagine how I would feel if my daughter
and then
went and lied about me like that.
And he brushes it off like, because she's an actress.
Yeah, and they're his enemies.
How can you not be grieved?
Right.
Instead of he says they're just spoiled brats. Hold on, who spoiled them if they're spoiled brats?
Right.
You can't have it both ways.
Yeah,
you can't have it both ways.
The way he's talking about his kids, it's just, when I talked to him on the phone, I'm thinking, you are not responding in a natural way. You are not responding like a parent. It seemed to me the only thing he was concerned about is people thinking he was qualified. And for weeks, Miriam had been gone and supposedly abducted, but then he only cares and thinks to dox his brother and do all the stuff that he felt necessary to do after everyone finds out, and they're mainly using that to prove he's disqualified because he was saying with the boys, well, they're all out of the house, they're adults, I can't do anything about it. Well, she's not.
Yeah.
But, so the thing is, now he needs to get her back in the house so he can act like he's got his house in control. It's too late. We've all seen this. And so this reaction that he has is very disturbing, and anybody who is looking can see it. And unfortunately, they're blinding their eyes to this. And here's why too. I know this is the case with many of these people. Many people who get caught up in the new IFB, they get all excited about the reprobate doctrine and all that stuff. And one thing they often do is they start reprobating everybody in their life. They shut everybody out of their life. Their family's all reprobates. They burn bridges. Their old church was terrible. They're always calling everybody out because it's so carnal. And then they have no one else. They have no one but that church that they moved to. So now they're out in Phoenix. All they have are people in that church. And so that gives him a great deal of control over them because they've burned all their bridges everywhere else. And I think that's all he has left are people whose families are all reprobates. They've burned all their bridges, and now they're stuck out there.
And there are people that have been kicked out of his church, too, that still support him, that are still like, no, they're lying. And
Stockholm Syndrome.
Well, years ago, there were guys that were used to be deacons and ordained, and then all of a sudden, a year later, they're not saved. You know what I mean? So should we be surprised that he's saying this about his own children? No. I mean, it's all about Anderson. It's all about saving face. But I don't know anybody there, at least I don't think I know anybody that's still in the actual congregation. But you must be an absolute nut job. You must be blind. You've got some serious deranged problems going on if you really think this is okay, unless you're just plugging your ears and you haven't listened to anything other than what he's saying, which is not healthy. But if you're not going to live in reality, I mean, what can you expect for your own family? Well, I feel sorry for your family because you're subjecting yourself and your family to this. What do you expect? What do you think's the end result? I mean, the fruit is going to permeate into your family, and We're supposed to recognize a pastor, consider the end of his conversation. We're supposed to, recognize the qualifications in Timothy. If a man can't rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Wisdom is justified over children. So therefore, a lack of wisdom is obviously evident in their children too. By their fruits you'll know them. And there's so many principles that show us that there ought to be some good fruit here, and there's a consistent pattern of bad fruit here, and 4 children in a row that are saying these things and making these accusations. And either you have 4 kids who are just collectively lying and making one of the biggest lies ever, or you got 4 kids who are telling the truth, and either way you look bad.
Well, and that sermon that you're talking about, he does. I mean, I was able to take it and I try to dissect. Look, this is where he's manipulating words. This is where he's using different words. And I did that. And then I got some sort of weird warning, not a full strike, but a warning from YouTube. And they took it down. They said I was cyberbullying him when I was I was literally just going through his sermon and doing that. But within that sermon, I heard it and I thought, because he's a great orator, he is convincing, people aren't going to understand. And I had a lot of people that were able to watch it say, hey, thanks, because you totally shed a light on how this actually works. One of his kids even said at one point, at one point, even after all this was going down, I listened to one of his sermons and I was almost convinced, but then I realized, oh yeah, no, wait a minute, he's lying. And it's amazing what he's able to do with his words and how he's able to manipulate and
like Tommy said, he's not stupid. He's not. He's intelligent. He has a great memory, and he knows how to word things or say things to manipulate. And all great icons that men have followed have that talent. Jack Hyles was that way too. Good with words.
I talked to somebody recently who hasn't been involved with Anderson for years, but was very involved with him at one time, and hadn't listened to anything a long time. But he heard about what was going on and went back and. He had even considered maybe saying something, and he had been thinking maybe I should say something, and then he went and watched one of the sermons where he was defending himself, and he was just like, it was so weird because when I heard him preaching, I got scared. I immediately was like, I can't do anything. And he's like, it blew his mind how. All these old feelings and fears came back that he hadn't had in years. Because, again, at one time, he had a lot of control and stuff over him. And it was. I wish I could remember exactly how he put it, but it was just, fascinating to him, realizing just kind of a power that was still there that he had kind of forgotten about. And he knew he doesn't have anything to fear, because he's not on his radar or anything right now. But at the same time, it was just the way he has used people, manipulated people. It's a very powerful thing. And I will say this too, that through the years, we've had many people that have reached out to us that go to these churches, and even recently in churches like Verity, Steadfast, First Works, we've had people reach out that they are freaking out in these churches, and they don't know what to do. My wife has had a lady that was contacting her on a burner phone, just because she does not want anyone finding out that, she is reaching out to my wife. But they are very disturbed about what to do. And what a lot of people in these churches are doing right now, while they don't approve of this, while they don't like this, they're just trying to get through it, and I think they're kind of hoping it's going to go away. But I'm telling nobody should continue supporting any ministry that supports Faithful Word, because that power that they have, it is spiritual abuse that they're doing, and these guys should not be able to get away with this kind of stuff, and they are enabling them. Churches who behave the way these new IFB churches do, they should be empty. They should shut down, and unfortunately, because all their friends are there, their whole life is there, they're putting up with wickedness, and they should not do that, and they're actually strengthening them to continue this kind of thing. They need to just trust God. They need to get out of these churches. They cannot put up with that stuff, and every one of these guys who has stood by Pastor Anderson at this point, they're beyond the hope of redemption as far as I'm concerned, because it's gone too far.
And it might be scary to them, right? Because a lot of people moved there just to be next to him, just to go to his church, right?
And let me just say, there are other good churches in Phoenix.
Yeah, since you're already there, right?
They might not be all post-trib, or they might not be everything that you want, but there are good gospel preaching, Bible believing, King James only Baptist churches in Phoenix.
Yeah.
My son goes to one.
And then there are the ones that aren't watching anything. Like you said, all they're doing is listening to him, and that's it.
And that's because that's all they were taught to do, and that's just shame on whoever taught them that. That's wrong.
Yeah.
And they need, and if they're listening to this, they need to realize that the biblical plan is a local assembly, not a TV on your living room. It's a local assembly, and major on the majors and minor on the minors, and choose the best in your area, or then move to one that you know God would have you to be. And there's no excuse to not find a local assembly or start one.
Yeah. And for these churches too that are still, involved or somewhat involved in the new IFB, I wouldn't worry about losing the Anderson followers in your church. Your church is going to be better off without them. We've had them come and go through our church, and we're better off without them. And we have people that are still in our church that, had followed him, but they grew. And now, I mean, I'm so thankful for the people in our church. Now, if they watch, it's because that's the same reason I watch it. We get addicted to soap operas. And the season finale of As the New IFB Turn has been hard to look away from.
It might be the series finale.
That's what I said. The series. Yeah, not season finale, series finale of As the New IFB Turns. It's so bad. And so thankfully, that's the only influence they have, is just fulfilling that guilty pleasure of watching soap operas.
I think I'd rather watch Andy and Barney. I mean, I call it a dumpster fire. Every time I open up Facebook, it's like, oh no, here's some more of it. It's just, but there is a need for people who don't know better to hear something like this and say, okay, I need to move on, and appreciate your local church and your local church pastor. And even if your pastor doesn't jump up on top of the pulpit, he's probably still a good man. Just give him a chance. If he's King James and he's following the word, just thank God for your local church pastor, who probably loves his wife and doesn't beat her and raises his children.
Yeah.
And our nation is suffering because of that. Mm-hmm. We don't have enough people spread out making a difference all over the world. We're collecting in the big city of Phoenix or somewhere else.
Yeah, and I have been very, brutal towards a lot of new IFB followers and people in these churches. And those of you that might be in these churches still trying to get out, I'm not like completely rejecting you. I'm just nervous about some looking for a new pope or wanting to move out with all your baggage. But again, I'm not totally against all of you. I don't know. I think some of the pastors are beyond the hope of redemption. But again, they have gotten a lot of people saved, but again, they're bad at getting them to grow. And if these people can just recognize the fact that, I got saved, I learned how to soul win, I learned how to call out reprobates, but I'm still a babe in Christ, I need to grow. If you can recognize that about yourself, then...
What else is there?
Yeah, then...
Besides saved and call out reprobates. Is there anything else we're supposed to be doing?
I don't know. I've been watching too much new IFB preaching lately. There's ways to have a good family without brutalizing your kids. There's ways to get your wife to be submissive without beating the tar out of her. There's ways to do that if you get around some godly people. And so, but you have to take one step that many in the new IB have never taken, and that is that step of learning some humility. And that's what it takes. And so humble yourself and realize that pastor that's been in the ministry for years and years and years, who is godly, has a godly testimony, has a godly family, even though he's a pre-tribber, he's still a better Christian than you are. And just follow his leadership, considering the end of their conversation. We're supposed to consider the end of their conversation.
Yep.
And we need people with a track record.
Speaking of humility, imagine Anderson or whoever, if they had stood up and said, it's all true, and I've been wrong. I've been wrong with my family. I've been wrong with my wife. And what I preached, a lot of it I still believe, but I haven't lived it. And then made a full confession. and then went and sat down as a layman with a job at Walmart or something, as just a regular member, still soul winning, still doing what you're supposed to be doing, but no longer trying to maintain the position of pastor. You tell me if that wouldn't have an effect on everybody.
Oh, yeah.
You tell me if that wouldn't be the greatest message he ever preached. And I got a letter in front of me from a missionary that's supposed to be in my church Sunday, but he's not coming because he just wrote me and said, I've got family problems. This guy's a good guy. I mean, if I said his name, a lot of people, he's known as the missionary. He said, I've got family problems, and I've got to stop what I'm doing, and I've got to go home and just take care of my family first.
Mm.
You know what? If this guy can get his family straightened out, he'll be back on the field, and we'll have him.
Mm-hmm.
And I can respect that guy. And I think that there's hope for that guy and his family. And it's about humility, because you only get grace with humility. God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And that's what's happening here.
Mm.
There's no grace. And there can't be unless there's humility. And I'm not sure with Anderson if that's possible. I think with God all things are possible, but it's a shame that he couldn't have demonstrated that example.
Mm-hmm.
Because that would have been a huge example of what you are supposed to do when you're not right with God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just said this happened in the past.
And what did David do? David had family problems, but David got right with God, and God spared his life. His family still paid, but David got right with God, not cover it up and not accuse everybody else.
Mm.
And I can't help but say that verse again. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Mm. So back when I mentioned when I kind of knew I was on my way out after they went after Pastor Boyle and Pastor Major, it was right after that. I remember the whole chat scandal took place. And I remember I talked to Pastor Anderson after that, and I told him, I said, listen, I'm just going to give you my 2 cents. You do what you want to with it. But I told him, I said, I think it's very important that the people in your church see you take this very seriously. I said, I recommend that you not do anything about it right now, but go tell your church, I'm going to take anywhere from 1 month to 3 months. It's like, you know what? I found out this stuff's going on in my family. I've got to figure out what's going on. Give me some time to figure out what's going on with my family. And then I will have people come fill in, and then I will come back after a certain amount of time, and then you all can decide if you want to keep me as your pastor. And he told me, he was like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but he's like, the people that are there's people in my church right now, they're using this because they hate me and they're just trying to destroy me with it, and I want them out of my church. And I told him, I said, I believe that, because some of them had reached out to me, which was why I called them, because I think they were wanting me to expose them. And I told him, I said, yeah, I think you're probably right, but I said, I wouldn't use this situation as an opportunity to get rid of these people, because, your kids were in the wrong on this situation. And he's like, no, I need to get rid of these people now. These are bad people. And I thought the way he handled that thing was terrible. And I think, if back then he would have done that and he could have showed his kids that, no, you guys are my first ministry. But unfortunately, he made the people in his church, and I know some of them were bad. He made them out to be the enemy and his kids almost the victims in that situation. And he pitted his kids against the church and his church against the kids. And that's the worst thing you could ever do as a pastor. I need my church rooting for my kids, and I need my kids rooting for our church. And then same thing too. When I talked to Pastor Anderson this last time, it was after the John interview. And I had heard some of the things that was going on with Miriam. And I told him, I said, it's because everybody's accusing me of just being a Pastor Anderson hater and envious and all that. Listen, I don't need anything from Pastor Anderson. Because I align with him on so many things, I don't want him to look bad. I don't want him to fail. It hurts me. I still, because of the things that I agree with him on, people want to associate me with him, and they like to bring up all of these things. And I want him to do good. I want him to succeed. And I told him, I said, I really think you need to step down because I think it's clear at this point you're disqualified. And if you do, I said, if you were to step down right now, it would show your church that you actually believe the stuff that you're preaching, and they will be able to hang on to everything you've taught that has been good. But I said, if you hang on to your position, I think more stuff's going to keep coming out. I said, I think your kids are going to keep coming after you. And I told him, I said, I'm afraid they're going to get Miriam. And I think if they get her, that it's really going to be bad. And it was like, I think it was later that week, she did that, which was probably one of the most impactful ones. And if he would have just then, he would have showed his kids, you're more important. You're my first ministry. And I messed up. I failed. And they're his kids. They're going to be forgiving. You know, they want to have a relationship with their parent. And to think that he just doesn't care about that. I mean, good night. The guy, he has this adorable little grandson. I mean, you know, to miss out on these things, and again, and it's not for the cause of Christ. No, it's not. People don't let him gaslight you into that. He is not being persecuted for what he preaches. He's being persecuted for his sin. He is suffering as an evildoer. He's not suffering because of the gospel that he preaches. His kids aren't coming after him because of what he preached about the sodomites or something like that. It's because of what he did to them. It's because of what he did to their mother. And he is suffering as a result of that. He is under judgment. I can't think of a worse judgment than having my kids hate me. I can't imagine having a grandson and him not being in my life. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. I don't want that for him. I want him to admit he failed and to admit he's disqualified, and I want him to step down, and I want him to fix his relationship with his kids because, again, I don't agree with the choices that some of his kids have made, but you know what? I did know those kids. I remember those kids, and I do care about them, and they do have a lot of good qualities, and I think if he could get these things right, maybe they can, get back on the right track, and I hate seeing families fall apart. It always bothers me, and I want to see the good things that he has stood for continue, but I'm already seeing many people who have been influenced by his preaching now questioning many of the good things that he has taught, and I don't want that to happen. And what all of you out there who are questioning everything you've been taught because of what you're finding out about Pastor Anderson, it's because you're carnal still. You haven't grown. You're still a babe in Christ, and it's not your fault. All you got was the milk. That's all. You thought you were getting meat when you were hearing him rip on other people's sins. That's not meat. Okay, meat's when he's getting on your sin. Okay? Their red hot preaching conference where half of it's just talking about Jews and the Messiah. That's not hard preaching. That is the easiest preaching. That's cotton candy. No, you guys need meat. And that's you're going to get meat when he's getting on your sin, when he's talking about things that are going to affect your daily life, not talking about how horrible all the people outside the church are. And so what you need to do is you just need to start growing. That milk he gave you was good, and it helped you get started, but now you need to take the next step.
Well, some are even like questioning they're one of two ways. It's like, no, so many people came to Christ because of him, so he's a man of God, so we're just not even going to listen to the kids at all. And then the other ones are like, wait a minute, so he did these things. Did I even really come to Christ?
Mm-hmm. Well, he's trying to make them think that by bringing up, the fact that, if you're saying I'm unqualified now, I was unqualified before you got saved, and it's just like, well, people who aren't qualified to be pastors go soul winning all the time and get people saved. Again, it's about the gospel. It's about the message. It's about Jesus Christ.
Right.
Far more than the soul winner.
Yeah. I mean, God used a donkey in the Bible.
Yeah.
Even a dead clock is right twice a day. It's not the human, it's God. And God has always used imperfect humans, but God does not use proud humans. And humans that are openly sinning, he's going to shun from them and take his glory from them. And that's why Samson died young. That's why Saul was removed from the throne, and that's why David lost a lot in his family, because God will be glorified in it. And yeah, I mean, my dad was saved at a Bill Gothard seminar. But that doesn't mean my dad would recommend Bill Gothard in everything today.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there are people who get saved with an NIV Bible, or some other translation, some other modern version. It contains truth, but that doesn't mean we push it or we put it up on a pedestal. We give God the glory. We don't give glory to the human as much as we do to the Lord. And so, but yeah, I suppose there are people who have a hard time separating the two. But did Steven Anderson save you, or did God save you?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think healing looks like for those that, just anybody that's kind of been harmed by or disillusioned by the involvement with the NIFB or Steven Anderson, and what do you think church leaders need to do to foster that kind of healing?
Receiving them into their churches, these people, if they're coming into other churches, is that what you're asking?
Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, even the NIFB churches that are there now, what should they be doing instead of what they're doing?
I don't have a lot of advice for the new IFB churches because, again, they don't believe in repentance ever at any point in their life. I don't think they're going to get anything right. I would say to pastors who get these people in their church, give them grace, cut them some slack on things. I think that a lot of these people, one of the problems that a lot of new IFB people have had going into old IFB churches is they go in there with a lot of pride. They've been told by Anderson, don't break fellowship, don't go to church just because of the pre-trib and all that, but they're still going in with a whole lot of pride. I think now a lot of these people, when they come in, are going to come in with some humility. So I think you got a good opportunity here. I think now a lot of these people going into these old IFB churches are going to realize, wait a minute, we were lacking something greatly in our new IFB churches, and I think they're going to be coming ready to receive it. And so even if you don't win them over to your side in the pre-trib and stuff, if you actually help them become better Christians, and we know several people, my wife is friends with some people who used to go to new IFB churches who have been in old IFB churches now for a few years. They're still post-trib and same on Israel and all that kind of stuff, but they are all expressing such thankfulness to be in these old IFB churches because they have grown as a family and their kids are growing and they're happy and their marriages have gotten better, and they're like, man, what was I missing all these years? And so in our church, in any church, I think we ought to just take the best of both worlds. Again, I'm not new IFB, old IFB. I think the new IFB's got some stuff right. I think old IFB's got some stuff wrong. We're independent. We can do what we want, and we try to have, the best of both worlds. But either way, if I had to pick one to go to, I'm going to the old IFB church 99 times out of 100, because in things that affect everyday life, they are better. When it comes to my children, my son is going to an old IFB church, and I feel much better about that than if he were going to a new IFB church. My two older kids that aren't married are dating people from old IFB churches. I would be very reluctant to let a new IFB guy date my daughter because I care too much about my daughters, and I would rather have that because I believe strongly that my kids have a much better chance of a happy marriage if they get somebody from the old IFB. And that's why, too, I had an old IFB preacher, well-known old IFB preacher, who was just like, if doctrine is what unites us, why do you want to fellowship with us when you're different on eschatology? And I told him, I said, because that's a very small part of my life. I said...
They can't believe it is a small part. They think it's a huge part.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a small part.
I said, when it comes to the things that matter to me the most, I'm with you. And I said, I can't help that I'm different about Israel and the rapture. I'm convinced of this from the scripture. I can't help that. But at the same time, I consider myself with you because of what you teach about being a Christian. I consider myself aligned with you more than I do the new IFB. And so these other things, they're noticeable things that kind of, are unique about us, that kind of drew us together. But that new IFB, because it was so centered around one man who had major faults, unfortunately, he has produced people who have the same faults. And now everyone that got involved with the new IFB that did not directly descend from Anderson and Jimenez are gone. And I think there's a reason for that, because we came from a different tree. We were cut from a different cloth, but we were the real thing, where these other guys, Anderson referred to himself, him and Jimenez last night as as he put it, the bastard sons of Stephen Nichols. And I think that's a problem. These guys are illegitimate as pastors. And I think their churches were illegitimate. And I think the fruit is proof of that. Whether we can go back and look at the details and who all's telling the truth on Anderson versus Nichols, I think the fruit speaks for itself. Look at those two churches and then look at the churches that they put out. And really, with the exception of Berzins, who got sent out in Anderson's earlier days when he was still more humble. I mean, look at Shelley, look at Mejia. The ones who look at Aaron Thompson. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's like it's getting worse. And I hate to. I don't want to just write off all of them. Some of these guys are proving to have some character, and we'll see how things go in their churches in the future. But those were bad trees. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, we were discussing earlier about the ordination, right, of Stephen Anderson and Nichols and all that. And I guess the two sides of each side of the story is, as far as Nichols is concerned, we didn't ordain him. We didn't have a formal ordination, and so we never ordained him, and that's the end of that. Stephen Anderson then comes out and says, well, but they were supportive of me, and he prayed for me when I left, and as far as I'm concerned, that's what an ordination is.
Yeah. Yeah, and let me say something about that, too, because, again, I have many preachers in my family. I've been in Independent Fundamental Baptist Church my whole life. I've been to many ordination services. I've participated in many ordination services. Not every church does things the exact same when it comes to ordination. Some it is very formal, some it is very informal. At the end of the day, it is up to a church, okay? A church churches start churches, and churches ordain people. Now, the pastor is the officer who performs these things. So the thing is, if Anderson was ordained, I'm not as concerned about what the process was. The process doesn't prove that somebody was ordained. It's the church that proves they were ordained. Now, Anderson claims because Pastor Nichols prayed for him privately in his office, that was his ordination. Well, we would have to ask Pastor Nichols, is that how you ordain people in your church? I kind of doubt it. And in fact, I know he does not claim that that's how he ordains people. I'll bet if we asked him how he's ordained people in the past, I'll bet it's been very public. I'll bet it's been done during a service. And what Anderson has shown in his evidence is that they were supportive of him starting a church in Phoenix. That's not the same as actually laying hands on somebody and sending them out. People come and they tell me about things that they're planning on doing all the time, ministries they're going to start, I'm supportive of anybody trying to do something. I might even give people some money to help, and we've supported different ministries, but it's a completely different thing when I'm going to lay hands on them and our church is going to start that church. There's a much different standard that we have there. So we would have to ask Pastor Nichols, what's your process for ordination? And did you follow that with Anderson? Anderson just declaring, here's what I think the Bible explains the rules are, and this just happened to take place with me. Well, if that's not the rules of that church, then it really doesn't count. And so seeing what Anderson's relationship with the truth has been lately, I'm going to lean more towards not believing what he's saying about that. And either way, look at the fruit. Look at his success rate in his ordinations. Look how many people he's laid hands on that he's later declared reprobate and things like that, as far as deacons and stuff. So something's very wrong with the spirit there. And I think it is the fact. I think he's right. I believe what he said in his sermon the other night about him and Jimenez being the illegitimate sons of Stephen Nichols.
And I don't know much about Stephen Nichols, but my understanding is he's an independent Baptist who's following the Word of God, that we would consider him one of us. And if he's saying, regardless of whatever happened, if he's recalling it, that's something we need to take note of. I mean, if Steve Nichols has gone off into left field and has proven to not be faithful to the Word, then I would ignore the recall. But if he's saying no, or he's saying this is not what we ordained, or this is not what we intended, or whatever, that should be something that you could take legitimate. But regardless, I guess he admitted himself he's an illegitimate son.
Well, I will say this: I ran into Pastor Nichols at a meeting about a year ago. I've seen, and I saw him again this year at that same meeting, and I talked to him about it, and he told me his side of it, and it made perfect sense. And I'm just going to say I believe him. He is somebody who has been very faithful in the ministry. Again, while I don't know him well personally, I do know many people who are friends with them, who have him in their church, and I will say he has a fantastic reputation. From what I know, he seems like he has a very good testimony in the independent fundamental Baptist world amongst what I would consider the right crowd. So somebody who has his reputation, I actually ran into his son recently too, and his son is working in a very good church that I'm familiar with, and seems to have a godly family. The man has an incredible testimony. While I don't know him personally, his reputation is very good. And so I tend to lean strongly towards believing what he says over Anderson.
And it's like what you said, if his church didn't do it the way they usually do it, and he's saying they didn't, then it didn't happen.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of people are struggling with, but then why did God use him so much and so long and so well? Let's say, okay, he was never even ordained. Then he goes out there and he starts this, and then he starts getting famous on YouTube, and then these movies come out, and then it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling. A lot of people are even coming to the conclusion of, well, even if all this is true, why are you bringing down a man of God that did so many things?
God wants people to get saved. Again, God uses foolish things. Anderson, I believe he could have repented many times. He could have gotten right. God was very merciful to him because God wants people to get saved. But at the end of the day, there comes a point, and I don't know where that point is. I have no idea where that point is. But God is not going to put up with these things for too long. And, he that being often reproved and hard at his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. And I think Anderson has come to that point. I think he got reproved several times. I think he probably, and I wasn't close enough to him in his personal life to know when those things would be. I will say 4 years ago when that Chats thing went down, I think that was another opportunity for him to get right. And I think he could have fixed it. God can salvage a lot of things because he wants to use people, and he uses imperfect people, but he will not put up with these things forever because, again, it ends up making him look bad. And so now we're to the point where, even though I think he did a lot of good things, I think now he's doing more harm than good. And some would even say he has already done more harm than good because unfortunately, and he's wanted to influence IFB, and I wanted him to succeed in his influence in the IFB in the areas where I think he's right. IFB is very political. Now, because they're so political too, this is going to turn them away from the things where he's right even more. And he's given, the post-trib. He's given the truth about Israel and the truth about repentance and all these things. He's given it all a black eye because he has been so vocal about these things. And he's kind of been a jerk about these things too, and then now with all this stuff coming out, people are going to blame the doctrine. That's what they're going to do.
He brags about or claims that he's led 200,000 people to the Lord. I was talking to Paul about that, and he questions that number. But let's say he did. But I have a question. How many has he led to Satan? Who has he actually worked for more? I'm not denying that God has used Stephen Anderson to reach people with the gospel, but how many people have been driven away from God by Stephen Anderson?
Because, another thing too, he brings up Jack Hiles, and like, and I acknowledge, one of the things I agreed with in his message that typically you go to a city, the best church is probably going to be a Hiles Anderson graduate. I would agree with that assessment. But at the same time too, when I hear about some kind of moral scandal, my first question is, was he a Hiles Anderson graduate as well? Because unfortunately,
it goes together.
They covered for that. They've produced both. Hiles stood for a lot of very good things, but they had some real flaws. And so they've produced both. They've produced those with the good qualities, and they've produced those with the really bad qualities. Those who remain in the new IFB, those who remain associated with Anderson and who refuse to renounce those things, they will continue to put out people in their churches that are good soul winners, and they will also put out child abusers and wife beaters.
How many children does Stephen Anderson have?
12.
Well, we already know what 4 of them think.
Mm-hmm. But what's going to happen in these churches too, and this just mark this down, okay? I'm not a prophet. I don't claim to be a prophet, but I'm not blind, and I just know how these things work. We are going to hear, there's going to be stories over time about abusive husbands, horrible situations of child abuse. I think we'll hear about it from stories from pastors doing it, church members doing it, and every time it's going to get associated with new IFB. And just like cover-ups and sexual abuse is often associated with IFB. I think we're going to see the wife beating and the child beating. We're going to see that associated with the new IFB. It's going to be a common thing that's going to come out, always making the good things the new IFB stands for look bad.
Already pre-tribbers are saying, see, I told you, those guys that don't believe in pre-trib, they think that Jesus is going to beat his bride, just like Anderson beats his bride.
Yeah.
And they say that.
And we're already seeing, we've already had people, we're getting horrible stories and even mugshots sent to us of people from these churches, who have, participated in this type of sin. That is going to be common. And the reports I'm getting too from Faithful Word too, all this preaching, it's just radicalizing a lot of these guys even more. And so this stuff doesn't happen overnight, but these kind of stories it's going to become very, very commonplace in the new IFB. All these pastors who are standing with him, eventually, because you're so much like him, your kids are going to do the same type of thing to you as well. If you're going to follow in Anderson's footsteps, you're going to end up in the same destination as he is in. And I can't imagine anything worse.
So what lessons can the broader Christian community learn from what's happened with the NIFB and Stephen Anderson?
Stop with the celebrity stuff.
We don't need celebrities. We already have one. His name is Jesus, and he won't let you down. He's always the same. It's human nature to want a human leader. That's why we're getting into the spirit of Antichrist these days. We need to just focus on the Lord, and we need humble pastors and humble people, and we don't need some superhero. We just need honest. And my family, we're not perfect, but we have one rule: you do not lie. No matter what happens, tell the truth. You tell the truth, we can deal with it. We can forgive, we can move on. But when you lie, you tear down the trust, you tear down the confidence, and there's nothing. And that's the same with our church family. We have to be honest and straightforward, and then trust that there will be forgiveness and restoration, and we avoid these huge pitfalls. But when we can't be honest because we're too big to fail, and that's the theme that's been an IFB theme for years: too big to fail. And that's a lie of the devil. God's big enough. We don't need certain, Baptist Pope here or this church here to not fail because it will destroy our movement. No. We have a big God. He's big enough. And when we get this idea that, well, no, he's too big to fail, so we've got to cover this up, that's a lie. Mm-hmm. That's garbage.
Well, and Jonathan Shelley himself, who when he had that meeting in his church was acknowledging a lot of the problems with Pastor Anderson and thinking he needed to step down. But then the next week he gets up and he made that statement that if Pastor Anderson goes down, where next?
Well,
It's like,
that tells you a
like-
lot right there.
yeah.
I mean,
And you
that's
know
an
what?
admission.
And you know what? I believe him.
Yeah.
I believe him.
Wow.
And that shows,
But that's an admission.
yes, that shows what's wrong with that movement and what people have got to get a hold of. Those of you who watch stuff online, okay? Often when people meet me in person, one of the things they often notice about me is I'm usually shorter than they thought that I was going to be. And, yeah. And the reality is, when people meet me too, I'm very underwhelming. Okay. Because with internet figures who are saying things that we like, we often want them to be certain things for us. And so we kind of have we create a false perception about them. And so you're always, so people are regularly, when they meet me, are disappointed. Okay. I've gotten used to that, but at the same, I
thought you were taller.
Yeah. I understand. Yeah. And I think I'm balder too in real life, but the thing is, and I'm not trying to be humble with that. It's just reality. And that's why you should never, ever sacrifice and lose the people you know and who know you for an internet figure who you think you know and who does not know you at all. And so they have created this false perception of Anderson, from watching him online and stuff. But, somebody who grew up around preachers and knows a lot and known them for years, not trying to be humble, we're just not that great. But we do have a great God who we have been privileged to be used by in a small way. And people have got to stop looking at us and thinking, wow, look at what these guys did. No, say, wow, God used them. God can use me. And that's one of the things that, too, as somebody who is from the preacher world, that was one of the things that, observing Anderson did for me is I recognized the fact that he's not that great, but I also recognized how God was using him in a great way. And it's like, man, if God can use him, he can use me. Even though I know I'm not as smart as Anderson, that he's got a lot of talents and things that I absolutely do not have, I never thought for 2 seconds God used Anderson the way he did because of Anderson. And so it did. It inspired me to, just get closer to God and yield myself to him so he could use me in a greater way. So let's just stop getting impressed with men and get impressed with God. When you see any man do anything great, get impressed with God and let that motivate you to yield yourself to him.
Chew the meat, spit out the bones.
Yeah. I just want to thank you both, pastors, for coming out here and doing this with me. Look, I had 2 other pages of questions, but I think we've gone on long enough. Maybe I can have you back at one point so we can get through these others. These were more like general accountability and leadership. But yeah, it's important for people to hear what you both think on all of this and how you're feeling about all of this. And because you were at one point involved, right? And so it's good that it's out there and people can hear what you're saying. So
yeah. Big picture, the cause of Christ suffers. A little bit smaller picture, independent Baptists get a black eye. A little bit smaller picture, those of us who know eschatology needs to be discussed, it gets thrown out the window with this excuse. And that's the sad part of it. But we can learn and move forward. And hopefully people will say, you know what, I'm going to just hang on to what truth I learned, appreciate it, even if I learned it from someone with flaws, but move on to a better situation, a better church, a better pastor, and not get enamored by someone on the internet, by a human, and just focus on the Lord Jesus Christ, looking unto Jesus.
Mm-hmm. What I'm hoping is going to come from all this, too, is a lot of people in the new IFB have been concerned that I'm going to try to take over as the new IFB Pope, and all these guys that are defecting from Pastor Anderson, I'm going to try to take them. If I had any advice for all the guys who have defected from Pastor Anderson, find fellowship in your own state, in your own area. There are good churches in those areas. I'm not saying if people need to talk to me or want to talk to me and be friends, that's fine. But nobody should need me. I definitely am not going to be the next pope. The popes always go down, and I'm not going down. So, but people need. What I would like to see is all of the new IFB become IFB and actually integrate themselves in the IFB, not infiltrate in the IFB. I'm not out there trying to change all my pre-trib IFB buddies. I encourage them because they love the Lord. They're getting souls saved. And, I teach what I teach because, if they can teach their stuff, I can teach my stuff too. But either way, I wish all those guys would do that. And I think it would do them wonders personally. I think it would help their churches greatly. Go find some normal old IFB guys. Get some old preachers. It's all young guys in the new IFB. Old preachers are a blessing, and there is so much you can gain from them. They are missing out on something so great as just older, experienced preachers. They will make a big difference in your life, and you need that desperately.
Yeah, instead of calling it the old IFB because you invented the new IFB, it's just IFB.
Right.
Yeah.
Independent Baptist.
Well, thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.